Welcome to Speaking Opera. My name is Howard Hart, and I'll be your host today. My special guest is Bill DePeter. We'll be discussing live opera on disc, A Brief History. This is part 2. We're talking now about where LPs have been made or CDs have been made, not tapes. Right. So,
well, I think it might be helpful to talk about that transition from LP to CD, because that was, a major change for that industry. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a number of labels never made that transition. So the MRF and BJR simply ceased production. Other labels like Ed's company, it took a few years for them to make that transition. They had to relearn everything because the technology had changed, and they had to find places that were willing to create this CDs, whereas previously there were LP manufacturers. So during that period, I had left the field, and about 3-4 years later, I came back to it and began essentially doing it all over again, but now on CD. And so, in addition to re-releasing all the things we had done before, we had whatever was new still coming along, and that was a difficult transition for the field, but in other ways it was a proliferation, because there was such an interest generated now by the new format, and people wanting to replace their LP collections and add to them. So I think during that period, that was a real heyday for us. We were able to do some really great work, and that was, as mentioned previously, when we had found the Callas Covent Garden Aida performance and other unusual things. There was a wonderful recording of I Puritani with Mirella Freni and Alfredo Kraus, and a Verdi Requiem from the 1950s with Leontine Price from Philadelphia. Wonderful performances that hadn't circulated in any form prior to that. So this was, for me, a really major time in terms of my career in this field.
We've met some people along the way, just to mention a couple of names, since you're talking about legato and lyric classics and so forth, that when you were there, the product changed the way it looked, and Jim Sellers, a.k.a. Giacomo Venditore, started doing the covers, and that was I think even in LP days, right? That he's got on board.
Yeah, he had done some LPs for us too, but he was very helpful in the transition, because a record cover could be very basic, but with CDs you really were required to provide more information, because as we all know, that the CDs had track listings. The performance was divided so that you could cue to a particular point in the performance. So that information all had to be provided in the notes or the whatever documentation you provided with the CDs. Mm-hmm. So there was extra work involved in that, and you needed someone who had some graphic design capability or experience to be able to do that. And Jim had a real flair for it, because he loved opera and had done graphic design as a hobby for himself, and that was a real boon for us, because we were able to do a more aesthetically pleasing product, so that when someone saw it, it would make it all that more desirable, because it was nice to look at.
Right, and then I think also John Gottwalt and Aubrey Barris had done notes for those recordings.
Yeah, we also were starting to provide more in terms of the background and the history of the opera and or performance and the performers involved. So that was more work for us to be doing, and finding people who had the right background and knowledge to provide that information for us.
You left the field in 1998. What brought that about?
Well, in the 1990s, we had another technical or technological advance, in that people were able to download and share and listen to recordings in electronic format, MP3 and various electronic formats, and that brought about the phasing out for a lot of people of CDs, especially with more popular music, pop and rock and those kinds of genres. So there was definitely an effect on the retail stores, and we in our live recording field we're feeling the pressure because a lot of the stores weren't able to sell our product, or they would end up returning it rather than paying for them. And I kind of saw the writing on the wall and said, it was time for me to move on. So I left and went into a totally unrelated field. I'm in records management now, and soon afterwards, many of the stores and chains who had been selling our product went out of business. And of course, today, a record store is like high button shoes or something like that, totally something of the past. We don't have them anymore. So that was kind of like the transition to a different way of buying and purchasing music.
It's interesting that we're doing this today. I'd lived in New York for many years. Now I'm living in Boston again. We're good friends. We go to opera a lot together. The beginnings and the endings of the CD as we knew it, and of course we all had huge record collections at some point, most of us. And I look at the field in general, and for many of us, some of our friends, mutual friends, continued and worked in the few record stores that were left. And other than that, and I think some other people I know that are very fine people that I know from the record business that I've stayed close friends with, many of us moved on. And I wanted to tell a strange story in the middle of all of this because I had a memory of the music business and how it was. There were so many wonderful people. I'm not going to mention names because there were so many of them. When I first moved to New York, that were in the music field, classical music. But I remember when we had done an interview with Lucia Pop, and she's just totally one of my favorite singers of all time. And we went to to Washington, D.C. to hear her in recital. And this is part of, I think, when I look back on it now, it seems so long ago, that the person who sold Angel Records, which was the classical part of Capitol, didn't know who Lucia Pop was. And he was there to represent Angel Records at her recital. I found that really disturbing. Oh, was it in the record store? I can't
That was
remember.
an in-store. I remember. I was
store,
with you,
yeah.
and he showed up, and he had a little printed bio of her. He said, "Oh, I guess I should read this so I know who she is." And we were both kind of taken aback.
I mean, that's for another time and another conversation. But the music field years ago, when I worked in record stores, you would people would ask how many symphonies did Schumann write? Right. How many did Beethoven write? How many piano concertos did Mozart write? And you couldn't get the job without answering those questions. Right. Granted, the salaries weren't great, but it was a lot of fun, and we met a lot of great people. And it's changed. It's changed. Yeah, one of the things I thought about with working with this subject is the love that people felt from all the labels that we'll talk about later. Yes. But they really loved it. And I thought of Forget. When I met him, I had some people were interested in MRF, and I was at German News, and we weren't really selling MRF, but we got some for somebody, some of his recordings. And I met him. He was a very delightful man. I really didn't know him well, but he did a Caballé imitation that was amazing. Mm-hmm. So, people loved singers. And I will ask you, that strange record that Ed Rosen never sold of duets. Tell us about that. I think that's kind of interesting.
Well, because Ed was friendly with a number of singers, in some cases they would visit him in his house, and he had a piano, and someone would sit at the piano and play the music for some operatic scene or duet or ensemble, and Ed would sing along with Cacio Ricciarelli and Jose Carreras, and in another circumstance, Ed was an amateur baritone, and he, like many people in that position, aspired to perform. He had done musicals when he was a teenager, but he had a friend who was in arts management who got him an engagement to sing Amonastro in Aida in Florida. And to prepare for this engagement, he was lucky enough to have Montserrat Caballé say that she was willing to help him learn the music for the big Act 3 duet with Aida and Amonastro. So he went to her hotel room when she was in New York, and lo and behold, there's a recording of Ed singing the Aida duet with Montserrat Caballé. So he had enough material to put out an LP, which he did, and he didn't sell it. I guess he figured that there wasn't perhaps enough commercial interest, but he liked to give it to friends and acquaintances and other singers so that they would know that he was actually a musician as well as a record producer.
It's a fun man.
Yeah.
I have very fond memories of that.
Yeah, but the demise of the bricks and mortar stores was a transition. But as most of us know, there are now on the internet, websites where you can purchase recordings. So CDs do continue, and you can purchase live opera recordings. But I think the trend has been now for a more legitimate release of these performances. Many of the opera houses, we'll discuss this later, have their own labels, or they work with other producers to release their live performances in a way that the artists are at least acknowledged or compensated somehow, so that there's a more legitimate approach to how these are recorded and released.
Some of the major recording labels that we know of that were in the United States, they also released live performances. How do you think those were different than the ones that were available on the live performances of more specialized labels, shall we say?
Well, I think the approach tended to be different. Rather than release something after the fact where no one had any previous knowledge or notification that hey, we're recording this and we're going to release it. The artists were, when they signed their contracts, knew that a performance is going to be recorded for a potential release, and typically they would record several performances if it was a run of performances, so that they could edit a nice, clean performance with no mistakes, and everyone at their very best. So I think that was a very different approach than what we had been doing, which was okay, here's this wonderful performance from 1950, and all the artists are retired or dead, and we're not going to go and necessarily tell them beforehand that, oh, hey, your wonderful performance from 1950 is coming out. But now I think the major labels approached it in a way to give it more legitimacy.
Bill, we're here today because a friend of ours, a mutual friend, Gary Jaskler, recommended this as a possibility for a focus of a podcast, and we both agreed, and thank you, Gary, for recommending it. We ourselves have known a number of singers fairly well, many of those singers are on live performances. Can we discuss that a bit?
Right, and I think Gary was also interested because you and I knew so many of the personalities involved in the production and release of these recordings, and that's an interesting history that hopefully others are interested in, and we can speak about it because we were there, we knew them, and I think that is of interest to me, and I would like to share what we both know on this very interesting topic.
Wow, that's loaded. I think I have to be very careful so that, some of the people we'll be discussing are no longer with us, but and I don't want to do them in any particular order because I have siblings, and I know choosing people by that kind of order is very dangerous. So should I start with somebody, or
Well,
would you like to?
I would suggest we start with Eddie Smith. We already mentioned him, and I think he is the first, the pioneer in the field. And as we're sitting here in my kitchen, we're looking at two fat volumes
Amazingly large books
that chronicle his discography and all of the hundreds of recordings that he released over perhaps 30 years in the field. He was the pioneer, but Eddie was an interesting character. I never met him face to face, but I had correspondence with him, and I bought records from him, and he had a reputation of just releasing lots and lots of stuff, and he had access to a lot of unusual things, very rare, and he was friendly with, as I think I mentioned earlier, with Lawrence Tibbett and other singers from the previous generation from when he started. And he also had a lot of contacts in Italy, and this wonderful discography chronicles all of that and gives a lot of information. But another aspect to what Eddie did was that he was not as careful about facts that as some of us might have wished. And in fact, a lot of the work that was done by the authors of this discography was to do research and, okay, what's really on these discs, as opposed to what Eddie said was on these discs. And some of it is fun, and some of it is certainly very informative. But Eddie would, if he didn't have all 4 acts of Aida, he would do the 3 acts that he had, and then just add an act from another performance.
Details.
Yeah, he might tell you, he might not. If someone had a bad high note, he might take a high note from another performance, and okay, well, we'll fix that for you. So he was a character, and I think we're all very grateful to him for what he produced and made available. But he was something like a very interesting personality, and clearly he must have loved this music very much to have spent so much time and effort to make so many things available.
I know the books are in a different part of the room, but roughly for people who can't see the books, how many pages in each of those books would you say roughly? They're amazingly.
I think there's probably 600 or 700 pages in each one of them.
Each book.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah.
And those are the only. It's with all of the people that have produced or made available live performances on LP and CD. I think those are the only 2 books, other than the other book that's there with the Eddie Smith books. Can you tell us about that book?
Well, the other book is a discography of opera recordings in toto. So it's the commercial ones and the live ones, and that's by a German compiler, Carsten Steiger. I think it was published around 2008, and so it's not totally up to date, but of course, most of the things that we're interested in have been around for a long time, but it's very informative in terms of looking back. Okay, what was available, and you typically will find a lot of things that you may have heard about or not even known about at all. So that's another major, for me, reference work that I refer to all the time.
Do you think there are any other books that are available that or chronologies or listings of works that have been available on live performances, or is that it?
There are, of course, numerous opera discographies, and there are surveys of opera recordings. But for the most part, the ones that I know about, the ones that you come across most frequently, don't address the live performance recordings unless they were released by a major studio. So, for instance, the performances from Bayreuth were recorded by the major labels. So, that type of live performance would be in them, but not the kind of things that the Eddie Smiths of the world were releasing. They typically will leave those out.
Of books, I'm guessing off the top of my head, and I have to refer to, or I will refer to the recording of books that I have in my own collection. Renata Scotto's book More Than a Diva, and the Magda Olivero book are two that come to mind, where they list live performances in the back of the biography and autobiography in both cases, I guess. But
Right.
are there many books like that of singers?
That's moving on to a different kind of book where you have a singer biography, and it's fairly common now to find a major biography that will have a chronology of all the performers' live performances, and typically the discography, if there is one, will include the commercial as well as live performance recordings. I think that's certainly more common now. There's a publisher in Italy, Azzari, who's released a whole series of singer biographies, and they typically include all of the recordings, whether they're commercial or live.
I remember when Octavio Roca was writing the book with Renata Scotto, and I organized the listing for the live performances as well as the studio recordings. It was a lot of fun, and he's a delightful man, Octavio. I haven't seen him in many years, but it was a very well-received book, and I love that book.
Yeah. And of course there are publications. There's a British publication, The Record Collector, and a lot of contributors will write articles about singer recordings. They did one of Beniamino Gigli, a famous tenor from the 20s, 30s, 40s, listing all of his commercial recordings in one issue and then all of his live recordings in another issue. So, certainly collectors have been tracking these things down for several generations. And of course, if we love the art as you and I do, then of course this is the kind of thing that you would be very interested in reading.
Do you think now that more of the live operas are available in file form, where do you think the direction is going with all of this?
That's really hard to say. I mean, as a collector, I typically collect CDs more than I would be interested in downloads or CDRs, that there's certainly fewer things coming out now. If you're a collector, you probably would already have a lot of the most interesting live performances. I just pick a singer by random, Maria Callas, for instance, who's just about everything she's ever recorded, whether live or commercial, has been released several times. Mm-hmm. So that I don't think you would see perhaps new releases of the old material again and again. I think you probably would be more likely that that's going to be something that people would look for in a different format.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, for instance, just as an example, the other day I went through my records and CDs, and I don't think I have all of them, but I looked at Maria Callas's first Tosca with Di Stefano and Gobi, and I have 7 versions of it on CD, hoping to get the one that I think is the best, and also the LP, which I prefer the most, from Electrola, Germany, MI pressing. But it's interesting how it just goes on and on and on, and she's not the only one. I mean, Domingo, Pavarotti, there are any number of people that have followings where people will keep rebuying and rebuying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we were just looking at an article by a Callas devotee where he reviews every recording of whether live or commercial, and gives you a recommendation of here's the best version that he has found, and that's the kind of thing that we as opera lovers and collectors are always looking to find.
I know we will be talking about the live opera performance labels, but could you tell us which one that is and who he is? For the Callas, the one you just mentioned, what is his name and the label? It's Divina, right? Is the name of the label?
Well, he's not really connected with the label.
Oh, he isn't.
Their website lists his articles because they tend to be very comprehensive, and he's very devoted to Callas, which is all that Divina puts out pretty much. So since they're very interested in Callas and her recordings and performances, his articles are very much of interest to them. His name is Seletsky. and he's written any number of articles about Collis's recordings and his opinion about the masterings and which ones are the ones to get. But we started with Eddie, and other labels that we've talked about already are MRF with Mauro Fuget, and BJR with Santiago Rodriguez and Charlie Johnson, and of course Ed Rosen with ERR, HRE, Legato Classics, SRO, so standing room only. So these were all very interesting personalities, and they all brought something different to what they chose to release, and what was to them important, including the quality of their releases, the singers and the repertoire that they found interesting and that they chose to release. Ed had one of the larger catalogs. MRF was also a pretty long listing, and BJR, they I think were more focused on quality than quantity. They wanted to, they were the gold standard for LPs at least. They had the most beautiful covers, and they were always included a beautiful complete libretto and in the original language and English translation, and wonderful notes. So they were more focused on making a beautiful final product.
I just wanted to interject something here. And we're going to continue with the labels. I would like to tell just a very short, very sweet story. I went to Rodriguez's one night for dinner, and Charlie answered the door, and he said, "Rod isn't here. He's downstairs working on some recordings." And I thought, I wonder what he's doing down there. And he had taken the Zaira. He was the champagne of all of them, as far as quality and beauty. All of it was just perfection. And he had issued the Zaira, Bellini's Zaira with Renata Scotto. And the covers were done in sort of a burnished gold.
There was a copper finish on the printed paper. A beautiful, beautiful visual.
So anyone that has one, I just want to share this. This is like some kind of icon or whatever. He had hand sprayed every cover because when you touched it, it left fingerprints. This was Rod. Yeah. He did everything in white gloves. Right. And the whole room, I went in and I was like, it was like it smelled like magic marker in there. And he said, "I'm spraying every cover individually, and I've asked people to return the covers so I can fix them so that fingerprints won't show on them." And that's a true story. Yes. He was amazing, amazing man, lovely man. But that's kind of meticulous work.
And I have a recollection that he had gotten one of his releases, and all the production was done, and they shipped them, and he received them, and something about the cover he didn't like, and he sent them all back. Mm-hmm. And there was another one I think he threw out. He just threw the whole run out because the quality wasn't what he wanted. That he was a true perfectionist. But he also chose some very, very interesting things to release. The Meyerbeer Le Prophète with Nicolai Gedda and Marilyn Horne. All of the wonderful Mexico City performances with Callas. He found the original acetate discs and meticulously transferred them, whereas others had used second, third generation tapes, and there was a lot of distortion and extraneous noise, which he was able to clean up. So if you wanted the Mexico City and the best sound, if he had it, you went to him. So he was one of the interesting personalities. I didn't know Mauro Fuget, but he had another very interesting catalog, a lot of releases. He tended to focus on the rarities, as you mentioned earlier, the Cherubini operas, Donizetti, and some of the other composers of the 19th century that weren't well represented.
Mercadante. He did a lot of Mercadante.
Yeah, and that was his main interest. And he also went to the extra effort to make sure that a libretto was included. I remember he did a lot of Mascagni. There were Mascagni operas that hadn't been recorded, and he tracked down the librettos, and you got the libretto with the English translation. So he was, very much devoted to that aspect of the releases that he put out. He also did very nice work visually, beautiful covers and nice quality. So he was another. Ed, of course, who I worked for, Ed put out a lot of stuff. He had a lot of singers that, as we mentioned, he was friendly with, and so he would tend to look for performances with singers with whom he was friendly, or they might actually send him a tape of a performance that they were interested in having released, and that was his focus. It was, these singers that he particularly liked. Though he also had an interest in unusual repertoire. He I remember did Mercadante's Il Giuramento, did Donizetti's Fausta, L'Isola di Roma, and he tended to look for a rare opera that also had a good cast. He wasn't so much interested in some obscure opera with obscure singers. That was not his main focus. But because he was friendly with so many of these singers, a lot of them would provide the tape and maybe some supporting documentation that would make it possible to release these recordings with enough information.
Thank you for joining us today on Speaking Opera. My name is Howard Hart, and I'm your host. Our special guest was Bill DePeter. We've been discussing live opera on disc, A Brief History. This is part 2. Please join us for part 3. All information on Speaking Opera and our podcast can be found on speakingopera.com on our website, on Facebook, on our Facebook page, Speaking Opera, also on YouTube, Speaking Opera, and we're also on Instagram. Thank you, and see you again for part 3.